So welcome everyone to our program. My name is Jessica Lorai and I'm the program director at the Interfaith Center at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. And the Interfaith Center is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to invite people from diverse secular, spiritual, and religious traditions to participate in one another's practices in order to cultivate appreciative understanding and friendship. We seek to unify people around common moral, social, and ethical concerns in order to build a more just and equitable society. And so kind of a relevant topic that we haven't talked about yet here until tonight, so I'm excited about this, is the topic of artificial intelligence and faith, or you could say AI and ethics. And so we have a couple of guests here with us this evening. And let me introduce our guests. Our first guest is Anne Skeet. Anne researches, writes, and speaks about the ethical dilemmas of leaders, corporate culture, and the ethical challenges of governance. She's Senior Director for Leadership Ethics at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University. She's also a member of the Partnership on AI's Working Group on AI, Labor, and the Economy. Anne writes about issues facing leaders across sectors regularly for her blog, Benison, The Practice of Ethical Leadership, and for other media outlets such as MarketWatch, San Francisco Chronicle, San Jose Mercury News, Recode, and CEO Magazine. We also have with us here this evening Brian Patrick Green, and he's the Director of Technology Ethics at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics. His work is focused on the ethics of technology, including such topics as AI and ethics, the ethics of space exploration and use, the ethics of technological manipulation of humans, the ethics of mitigation of and adaptation towards risky emerging technologies, including ones with catastrophic risk potential, and various aspects of the impact of technology and engineering on human life and society, including the relationship between technology and religion, particularly the Catholic Church. Green is a member of the Safety Critical AI Expert Group at the Partnership on Artificial Intelligence to Benefit People and Society. He also helps to convene several academic discussion groups on AI and human nature involving the Vatican's Pontifical Council for Culture. Green is co-editor of a special issue of the Journal of Moral Theology on AI and moral theology. So welcome to both of you. And let's start off the conversation this evening with what are the major ethical issues in the world of AI currently?
Jessica, thank you so much for that kind introduction and for inviting us here this evening. I'll just talk about a few ethical issues that I think are really primary right now related to AI. Those that include things like safety. Is it actually safe? Does it actually work? When it comes to a self-driving car, does it get you in an accident or does it get you where you're supposed to be going? There's issues with privacy in terms of collecting all this data, and then an AI system can collect much more data than a human centric organization could ever kind of collect together and process. Also issues with transparency. Can you understand what AI is doing? And then there's a lot of issues having to do with bias, of course, and fairness, justice, these sorts of issues. And the issues, I mean, they really go on and on. So I'd particularly add a few that maybe people don't think about, which is the environmental impact of AI. For example, AI uses a lot of energy. And so in order to run these data centers and train these large machine learning models can use a huge amount of energy. And if it's renewable, that's great. But if it is fossil fuels, then it's very bad for the environment. And then there are just many more issues related to work and inequality, and how is money going to flow through society if so much automation, for example, takes over jobs? and the issues just keep going on and on. I'll turn it over to Anne.
Well, it's a good and daunting list that Brian can always gen up for us. And so thanks for that. I tend to think more about the impacts on us as human beings and our humanity. One of the things that leaders are always responsible for, we do a lot of our work in groups, and leaders are typically, coming forth because a group of people have come together to try and accomplish something. And in the organizational life, we know a lot of that, the ability to do that in a kind of healthy culture depends on having strong and empathetic relationships and kind of a sense of community. So I think a lot about what AI might, or the way we implement AI, how it might affect those relationships and that sense of community and potentially erode it if we're not thoughtful about it. I was back visiting my mom earlier this week. She's been sick, so I trotted back to the East Coast for a visit. And at one point, she wanted to say a prayer. She started praying, and I couldn't quite hear what she was praying, but eventually I recognized it as this prayer from the Rosary. And the only reason I recognized it was that I had asked a friend of mine who's a religion teacher about to kind of remind me how to pray the Rosary a little while ago. And while she and I were talking, I started to feel a little bit sheepish because I was like, oh, I could have just looked this up on Google, right? I didn't really need to ask my friend. I could have just found this out myself. But my friend and I ended up having this really interesting conversation. She connected me to this prayer. And as I was saying the prayer with my mom earlier this week, then I was thinking about that friend. And I was thinking about the work she does as a second grade religion teacher. I was thinking about the relationship she has with my mom and what I've learned from each of them about faith and faith practices. And in that moment, I felt sort of that connection to my friend and comforted by her, even though she wasn't there. And I was able to convey to my mom, like, oh, Robin reminded me about this prayer. And so all those little subtle kind of connections just in that one moment of sitting there with my mom around this single prayer would have been really different if what I had done when I wanted to remind myself how to pray the Rosary was Googled it. And so I think it's those kinds of that context that we all are offering each other all the time in life. That's really, to me, the biggest risk and the one we need to be the most thoughtful about and work with leaders to be the most thoughtful about.
Great. Thank you. Brian had mentioned and I'm going to ask you to maybe go a little deeper into when you mentioned AI bias as one of the issues for some of the folks who may not know exactly what that means. Can you explain that to us a little bit better?
Sure. So large machine learning models are very dependent on the data that's fed into them. So for example, if you feed them data that they pick up on the internet, then they're going to say bad things that you find on the internet. And that's a form of bias, right? This idea of bias is very much just because you train these models on human beings, and human beings are biased. So they just pick up the same biases that we have and make those same mistakes. Now, this has become something that a lot of people are very concerned with recently. I should say in the last 4 or 5 years, it's really become a noticeable thing that people are talking about and also trying to solve. So they have, for example, determined that there are ways to figure these things out and try to de-bias these machine learning algorithms. So for example, if you look at the history of loan data for small business loans, you'll discover that small business loans have historically been biased against women. They've been biased against minorities in the United States. And if you know that, then you can do something to try to stop that bias from coming through in future in future loan selection, as you are kind of dealing with, if you wanted to use a machine learning model for that. Now, there's good questions as to whether you should do that or not. But if we already know that the problem's there, maybe the de-biased machine learning model will actually be better than human beings if we know that human beings are biased and make these mistakes. So you can for example, try to even everyone out so that different groups of people are being treated equivalently. Now that'll obviously make the groups that used to be treated better than average maybe a little bit upset, and it will have the other groups who were treated worse obviously should be happier because they'll be getting treated better. But this then raises huge issues of fairness, which is kind of the next question that always associates with bias. What is actually fair in this situation? Are some people getting through the process too easily for a small business loan? And if so, should they be pushed down to be closer to the other groups? Or should the other groups all be lifted up to be equivalent to the higher group? And that's a difference. That understanding of fairness is not at all clear. You could pick some level that's between the two, or there are other notions of fairness based on other biases in society. Maybe you should intentionally give women and minorities even more advantages than you would give to the groups that were being advantaged in the past. So it raises a whole bunch of fairness questions within this bias topic, and it's not something that's easy to solve. There are these questions are serious. There are laws about them, so these companies have to be aware of what the laws are. And at the same time, even with the law there's still a lot of space to either change things up and make them different or easier, more tractable in some ways, but sometimes making it more tractable isn't necessarily that easy solution isn't necessarily the right solution. There's still a lot of room for thought and trying to figure these things out.
I think this example Brian shared is, takes me to another leadership, ethical leadership practice, which is sort of this awareness and this willingness to contribute to the larger ecosystem that any company is operating in. For example, there's the industry they're in, or the country that they're doing business in, or the global environment. And one of the things we're becoming aware of is this lag between innovation, the cool new technology, and then the infrastructure that needs to kind of catch up with it. So just in what Brian was just describing there, we have these algorithms, and they're really wonderful, and they can help us. And then we also need to be thinking about, as he said, those questions of, do you elevate one group? How do you make it start to work so that it's got all the other parts of the system that are supporting the innovation, so that the innovation can be used to benefit humanity. And I think that lag, we see it in so many places. We see it in healthcare. You can live longer, but then do we have the quality care systems in place for the elderly once they are living longer? Or, just lots of different examples that we can see where we need to kind of catch up with ourselves. And so that becomes the work of leaders to really try and address that.
We had spoken in a kind of a preliminary conversation before the program, and you had mentioned about the rate or how fast technology is moving, and that there are kind of a sector of the industry who was or is still in the mindset that we should develop everything as quickly as we can and just keep going with it and see how far we can take it. And would you mind sharing a little bit about that with regard to ethics and where are we as an industry of developing AI? Where are we on that spectrum now? Is it still forge ahead, or are we kind of pulling back and saying, well, let's build some ethics into this? Or how are we standing there today, would you say?
You want me or Brian to comment on that?
I think you should go first, Anne.
Well, I think this is one of the things that global leaders are sort of doing really well, and permit me a little oxymoron. They're sort of they're building momentum for slowing down. Or one of the things that we talk about are gating mechanisms. And we're starting to see in some of the research we've done, both Brian and I have worked with the World Economic Forum, and and so we've talked to companies around the world, and we're starting to hear some real acceptance of just, we need to build into our practices and our design processes inside of organizations moments where we pause and we stop and ask ourselves these questions. And I think that's really healthy. And we also, I think, have to pay attention to what we're hearing from the marketplace and from consumers who, we're starting to read some stories about people who are going back to flip phones or trying to find ways to kind of de-technify their life because it's become so complex. And it is starting to overwhelm some people in certain parts of life. And so we have to, I think, be thoughtful about not over designing just because we can. Oh, here's all this cool technology. We still always want the technology, to be solving problems, to be making a positive contribution. That's what the promise of technology has always been and will continue to be, I think. But I'm grateful, frankly, for the courage of a lot of leaders at all levels and in many sectors who have started to say, yeah, we gotta slow down a little bit.
And I would just build on that and say that speed mentality is very much still there in every tech company to a greater or lesser extent. But I think that what they're discovering, at least some major tech companies now have come to the realization that speed is not a virtue at all costs, right? It's not the only thing that's important. Because if you go really, really fast and make a big mistake, then the only thing you've been doing the whole time is speeding towards a big mistake. And some companies have recognized that, and they said, we need to slow our process down, and we need to do the ethical analysis. We need to, if we're going to maintain trust with our customers, if we're going to maintain a good reputation in society, then we need to slow down and make sure that we aren't making big mistakes. Because getting hauled in front of Congress isn't the highlights of the CEO's lives, right? It's not a good thing. And yet at the same time, there are other technology companies that are really having a struggle to get out of that speed mentality, where they feel like they still very much just have to rush all the time, and they feel like ethics is slowing them down, and they don't think it's worth it yet. And I think it's this realization is spreading. It's getting more widely held. However, not everybody is on board yet, and it's really something that there's a trend in that direction towards the slowing down and evaluating the products more thoroughly, but not everyone's there yet.
And some of that pressure is coming from consumers and employees, right? Mm-hmm. So millennials and Gen Z, they have grown up with an inclination to be very vocal about their values and to sort of demand a consistency of value application, in all quadrants of their life. So they don't want to hear the kind of just the lip surface in the office to climate change or things that are, diversity, equity, and inclusion and justice. They don't want those things to just, sort of get hung up on the wall, but not really addressed. And so they're putting a lot of pressure on organizations to actually authentically engage in the issues. And I think they're creating the space for market measurements to be a little bit different then. So if you can recast what you're trying to do as an organization, articulate the audiences that you're trying to serve and the goals that you have over the long term, the market might be more tolerant of long-term thinking than it has been in the past. So I see that again as a real positive change.
Great. Thank you. The other, I just wanted to, for people who may not know what we're talking about when we say with one of the ethical issues or concerns is more of a long-term or even the existential risk that AI poses, and how can AI pose existential risk in case we aren't sure how that would happen?
So I would say there are a lot of people who are concerned about AI and existential risks. So for example, if you existential risk is anything, on an individual level, it just means it kills you, or on a social level, it means it destroys a large, either group of people or ultimately leads to human extinction. So we've certainly had movies like the Terminator movies and other things like that, where we have this fictional understanding of what could go wrong with AI. But there are things that are certainly not to that extent, right? There's that fear. Some people have that fear, but I think there's some steps short of that that can be thought about. So, for example, at the end of the Cold War, the Soviet Union had a mechanism, which is that in case their leadership died, they would launch basically a satellite that would automatically broadcast to all of their people, all of their launch officers in their nuclear weapons corps to automatically launch the nuclear weapons. And the system was called the perimeter system, but it had the nickname of the dead hand, just to give it something poetic and horrible sounding. And I think that we should recognize the United States, as far as we know, never produced something like that, but we should recognize that with the systems that we already have politically on Earth, there are these sorts of terrible incentives to do really, really bad things with AI, and to say, oh, let's just put all the nuclear weapons under the control of this artificial intelligence. And then that's when you suddenly find out that bias is really important, right? Or that's when you suddenly discover that your system wasn't as technically safe as you thought it was. I honestly, I don't think we're there yet where we can trust this sort of thing. And yet we know from historical examples that this has happened before, where people have tried to automate these sorts of doomsday type weapons. And of course, you can think of Dr. Strangelove and all these other movies from back in the day. And you think to yourself, why would anyone ever do that? And the answer is because people think it makes sense. So with artificial intelligence and existential risk, I think there is that kind of understandable and horrible logic that's in play there. But at the same time, there are certainly lesser risks that come from artificial intelligence. For example, there's this stereotypical example of if you tell a super intelligence, an artificial super intelligence, make paper clips, and then it makes the entire world into paper clips because that's what you told it to do. So there are these kind of comical in some ways, but also there's a logic behind them, right? Which is that if you tell an artificial intelligence to do something, it'll do it. It'll do exactly what you tell it to do. And so it becomes really important to tell it the right things to do so that it doesn't do something very, very silly. And there's also another breakpoint, of course, there, which is that it's not just about the objective that you're aiming for. It's about how much you empower the system. If the system just advises people and says, oh, maybe you should do this or you should do that, then it's still humans making the choice. But if you automate the system, then you get a completely different answer if you empower it to be completely automated. There's this joke that I heard once from people talking about lethal autonomous weapon systems. It's not like the military is going to walk out onto their airfield one day and all the weapon systems will have flown off and started a war on their own, right? We're not going to be empowering a lethal autonomous drone to just take off on its own, refuel itself, arm itself, and then, fly away and go do something by itself. That's not something people are likely to do. However, on the other hand, we are empowering them to go and, send them out to a specific area and say, look for targets. And that's something that the drones actually in the Ukraine right now, I believe they said that Russia was deploying some drones with that ability where they just kind of float around the battlefield until they find something to attack.
It's because of stories like this that I think we also need to return to some basics. Some governance basics is sort of what I'm thinking about, and kind of some practices that we know have served us well in organizations over time, kind of checks and balances, where we identify conflicts of interest and we sort of say, okay, well, we need one group to propose things, but then we need to sort of set up another group to play the devil's advocate or to ask and poke all the questions at that. And so I'm thinking about some, recent tragic examples like the Boeing Max aircraft crashes, where some of those got short-circuited. People got very comfortable, so comfortable and trimmed up resources in the regulatory environment that Boeing was actually kind of self-regulating itself, doing some of the things that the FAA used to do in approving changes and modifications to airplanes themselves, and then sort of self-reporting it. And I'm sure at the time that seemed like a really, oh, look, we can save some money, some time. We're getting the people who are closest to the work and have the greatest expertise. We're getting their insight. It can all sound good if you say it fast, but in fact, the uncoupling of, the people who are making something and then the people who are approving that it's ready to go is actually a really beneficial approach and a prudent approach. And so those kinds of things that have served us well for many centuries, we need to get back to some of those. And I think those really, a few in some very unfortunate and obvious cases, we've had to learn the hard way.
I would just build on what Anne said and say that there's actually a lot of wisdom that can be transferred from organizational psychology and from governance and things like that right into the AI field, because ultimately artificial intelligence, you can think of a bureaucracy as being something like an artificial intelligence. It's a way to scale human intelligence from outside of our own little heads into a large group of people. But an artificial intelligence, if you start building something that's more intelligent than one person, or that embodies kind of the intelligence of a group in itself and kind of automates it, it could definitely benefit from the same sort of checks and balances, right? What's the governance of this? Who's going to make sure that it's doing the right thing? Are there different things that you can implement in order to make sure that it's doing the right thing ultimately? And if it does make a mistake, how do you correct it and prevent it from happening again?
Some of the technology companies in Silicon Valley that I think are struggling the most with this, with the ability to slow down and be more thoughtful about their product development and their choices in what they bring to market, are actually also companies who have short-circuited the governance of their own organization. They've really, they've concentrated too much decision-making and authority in the hands of too few people. And in some cases, really kind of kneecapped their board of directors in terms of how much authority and influence they can have, or restraint that they can place on the executive team. And I know from having been around Silicon Valley entrepreneurs for the past 30 years, that's every founder's dream, right? As I'm going to found the company and be able to call all the shots and make all the decisions and never give that up. But the more mature approach to doing the work is to accept some of those challenges from other people and those very good questions that can come from other sources, and allow them to make you better and to make the work that you're doing truly achieve the original very good goals that you might have set for your organization.
Wonderful. Thank you. Let's move on to the next question I have here for you both, which is, how can faith communities add to the discussion about ethical AI?
I think interfaith communities, I've done some work with them here in Silicon Valley, and I think one of the most wonderful things about them is that they can quickly identify some common values across faiths. And once they've done that, it allows them to move, ironically, given everything that we've just said, move a little more quickly to start affecting change. So that's, to me, the real advantage of the interfaith movement, if you will, or interfaith collaborations. It's sort of a network of networks, right? They all have their own communities that they can draw on and bring information to. But when people see that leaders from different faith traditions are speaking with one voice on a topic, that's extremely powerful. And it really, it says something to the followers. We talk a lot about ethical leadership. There's also ethical followership, all the choices that each of us makes about who to follow and what practices and what values. And again, I think there's some real reinforcement in the interfaith community that makes them especially effective.
Yeah, and I would build on that and say that various faith traditions have so much ethical knowledge built into them a lot of the time, so much that they've encoded in their tradition. Sometimes it's very, very explicit. Sometimes it's more implicit, and you have to pull it out and tease it out a little bit more. And it might be sometimes difficult to figure out where the connection is with something like artificial intelligence or technology ethics. This can be it's an issue that's just, it can seem like it's really far away from an ancient tradition. And yet a lot of the times the connections are really there. You just have to look for them and make the connections. This is something Anne and I have both been working with the Pontifical Council for Culture at the Vatican, and something that the Catholic Church, for example, has been working on a lot recently is trying to figure out what does this mean? What is this transformation of AI that's going on right now? What does it mean for the people in the world? Because fundamentally, we want to make a better future. We want to make things, go well in the future for everyone. It's kind of a fundamental ethical, aspect of the Catholic faith and of so many other faiths as well. And so then the question is, how do we think about this? And is there something that we can bring to this conversation? And there have been meetings between folks at the Vatican and various people in the technology industry where they've started discovering these sorts of connections. And they say, people from the Vatican say, oh, we had no idea that technology could even do this. And then people who are more from the technology side of things say, oh, we didn't know that you had already thought about this question. We thought that we had to think about this all over again. But now we realize that there are useful resources that we can appeal to. And this is something I do also. I just recently talked to a technology company where I said, you're wondering whether your technology is being used for bad purposes. So they did, of course, develop their technology for good purposes, and they know it's also being used for evil purposes. And I said, here is a very old tool from the Catholic tradition called cooperation or non-cooperation with evil. When do you cooperate with something bad or not? And you can just go through, it's a framework. It's pretty simple framework for looking to see whether you should actually be cooperating, whether you should be creating this technology that can be used for bad or good purposes. And they found it to be useful. It's something where they look at it and they said, okay, this actually makes sense now. This is helpful. And I'm sure there are so many other traditions out there. I don't know what other traditions say about this, but there are people out there who are more familiar with them, who I believe can bring up more of these tools and ways of thinking that'll be helpful for evaluating technology ethics.
I think the interfaith community also provides a means for communication, which is so critical right now as things have gotten so polarized in the workforce, in communities, politically, globally. And you can see that both, again, sort of on the macro level in organizations. There are employee resource groups now, which is some of the ways that those employees are bringing those values, giving voice to values in the workplace. And it's not that surprising to me that many of those employee resource groups are faith-based, and they might be interfaith-based or they might be single tradition, but it's a desire of people to wrestle with the issues they're wrestling with and to do it through a values lens that helps them to figure out what's the right thing to do. So again, as part of our work, we have a framework for ethical decision-making, and it helps you to sort of identify, draw attention to when there are ethical issues and get the perspectives of stakeholders. And then it gives you some lenses to figure out what to do with those, how to decide what's the right thing to do at any given point in time. But then you have to motivate people to actually act on that. And in that motivational piece, we definitely see that when people have a values-based rubric for making decisions, and they've spent some time articulating those values, and they've developed them with diverse groups in all ways, both the traditional sort of social diversity, both surface level and deep level, but also functional diversity, that those values are more likely to get used in the workplace. So that's kind of the macro way that I see that it can contribute to, it is contributing and being used in communication. And then on the micro level and just the personal level, just for maybe one other story, also from this week, this trip to visit my mom. After our visit was done and I got back on the plane to fly back here to the West Coast, I settled in my seat next to someone who immediately shared with me that their affection for the former President Trump and their frustration with the current federal mask mandate on airlines. And, he had his mask and it was sort of hanging down. And it was clear to me that he was really checking out to see if I would be okay if he didn't wear his mask. And I thought, well, I'm not okay with that. I like the federal mask mandate for a couple of reasons. And he said a few other things that helped me to appreciate, we really have different points of view on a lot of things, just very quickly. And I could have gone at it sort of directly and sort of said, well, this is what I think about the mask mandate or this political party versus that one. And instead, I just shared with him that I was returning from visiting my sick mother, and I was coming home to my family here, where one of my family members is immunocompromised. And as soon as I shared that, he didn't say anything, and he kind of reached over and he put his mask back on. And so clearly something had been communicated there, and he'd responded to something there. And he actually then offered what he had responded to, that sort of, golden rule, sort of taking care of each other, that many faith traditions have. But then he also just started to talk a lot about his own faith. And it was different from mine. And I told him what my faith tradition was. And then we ended up sharing all kinds of information. He was an electrical engineer for a trucking company. He had perspectives on the global supply chain issues. We talked about the situation in Ukraine. We talked about our different faith backgrounds, and all of that. I imagine how that could have gone differently if we hadn't been able to identify pretty early on in the exchange just a common value. And what we learned in the discussion was that it did come from our faith traditions. So I see real benefit in drawing on the interfaith experiences of that people have and can bring to bear in their everyday lives. And that's part of what we do at an Applied Ethics Center is try and help it be very practical and very real in everyday decision making.
Thank you. I love that story. Thanks for sharing it. Do we have anything else, Brian and Ann, that we would like to talk about prior to opening it up to questions from our participants here? Is there anything that I forgot to ask or?
I guess one thing I would say is that artificial intelligence is a technology that's going to be becoming more and more prevalent going forward, and to a certain extent, calling it intelligence isn't the right thing. I would personally like to reserve the word intelligence for intelligent living creatures, or intelligent spiritual beings, if you want to come at it from a more religious perspective, because really I think what might be the better way of thinking about it is that artificial intelligence automates decision making a lot of time. It's a shortcut for going faster than humans can go, or for processing more data than humans can process. And it can do some very amazing things. I don't want to say anything bad about it in general, but I think we should consider what exactly we're doing when we are automating these sorts of questions. If we are automating loan decisions, for example, or if we are automating driving of a car, there's all this decision making in there. And it used to be that, you know, humans made decisions. We were the people who made decisions around here. But if we're delegating that decision making power to an external kind of force, then we need to recognize that it might not always make decisions that we think are correct. And that ultimately is where the conflict comes from. Do we actually trust the system that we're working with? So a lot of the times when I'm talking to technology companies and they ask questions about ethics, they say we want to be ethical because we want to be trustworthy, because we know, and then comes the business aspect of it. People don't want to work with a company they don't trust. So there's ultimately that monetary motivation behind it. But I think that that's not necessarily a bad thing. It can be a bad thing if they're being duplicitous and lying about trying to be more ethical. But ultimately, they realize they need to be trustworthy, or people are not going to trust them and they're not going to buy their products. And that, I think, is something that we should recognize is actually a fundamental alignment in a good way between the public and the company. The company wants to, if they're having a long-term perspective, they recognize that they need to have a good reputation. And the only way to really have a good reputation is to actually be a good company. And the companies that have recognized that have progressed on that path and are doing better, I would say. And the companies that haven't yet recognized that are, I would say, they're going to discover why they should recognize that. they're going to realize that they're not always going to be able to do these bad things that they've gotten used to doing, because eventually they're, either a competitor is going to take their business away, or something else is going to happen where they finally realize that they could get externally regulated by the government or something like that. Eventually they'll realize that they're behind the curve and they need to actually make the right decisions so that they can be trustworthy and thereby trusted. And yet they're still going to have to deal with all the bad decisions that they made before then, which are going to come back and bite them for years and years and years as they have damaged their reputations and continue to have those damaged reputations.
I would say that the other piece maybe that we haven't talked about as much that people can be thinking about is how much each of us derives our sense of meaning and purpose and dignity from the work that we do. And a lot of the early expressed anxiety anyway around artificial intelligence has been around, how is it going to change my experience at work? Is it going to replace what I do? Will there be an opportunity for me to earn a livelihood if we continue developing various forms of AI? And so some of the, you touched on the fact that both Brian and I are connected to the Partnership on Artificial Intelligence. And in a working group that I participated in, we looked at sort of these humanity-centered design principles and created a framework that allows organizations, employers, and boards to think about what this is doing to the nature of work and the people in the workplace. It's a framework for workforce well-being in an AI integrated workplace. And it asks some questions about, what will the impact of introducing intelligent systems that learn from their environment be in the workplace? And how about collecting data on workers and the work that they're doing and how that data gets used? How will it change the relationship between people and their employers? Those kinds of questions. And so we offered these sort of 6 pillars around human rights, physical safety and health, which Brian touched on earlier, financial well-being and intellectual well-being, and emotional well-being, and again, that sense of purpose and meaning, so that it has a set of resources for boards in their oversight role and for senior executive teams in their management responsibilities to think about and to work with people in the workplace around to try and address some of those up front so that we can reduce some of the anxiety. We can accept responsibility. And I hear more and more leaders talking quite open, corporate leaders talking quite openly about they see that they have a responsibility to retrain people, not just, after the fact, after they've left the organization, but as part of their employment in an organization. So I think those are positive changes. And certainly that's what that resource is designed to be, is make a positive contribution to the way that people are thinking about that one source of anxiety.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take a question here from the chat. And the question is, do you think artificial intelligence is the future of growth? And if so, why? Or if not, why?
And you want to field that one, or should I go?
You can start.
All right, I'll start. What I would say is that certainly AI is going to have a huge impact on growth. But it's kind of a strange impact because it's growth that is going to be at the same time shifting the way as Anne was just saying, really shifting the way that labor and the economy work with each other. So it'll be growth that strongly advantages those corporations that are using it and strongly disadvantages other corporations that perhaps do not implement it as well. And it's also going to be, of course, leading to a lot of unemployment potentially. And so it's a kind of growth that's in some ways it's kind of a centralizing growth or kind of a disempowering growth in a lot of ways. It empowers some people in a very unequal way. So we really need to think about what kind of society we're building, because we could potentially let's see, I heard this statistics recently on the gross domestic product of the United States. Currently, the gross domestic product of the United States is paid out as something like 2/3 of it is in the form of wages to labor, and something like 1/3 of the gross domestic product is paid out as return on capital. In other words, stocks and those sorts of things, investments and those sorts. And you can envision what's going to happen if artificial intelligence starts eating up more and more of the economy, which is that more and more of that GDP that which would have gone towards labor is instead going to become return on capital. And so the people who already have the money are going to get richer, and the people who lose their jobs are obviously going to become poorer, until eventually you can anticipate, if artificial intelligence someday becomes so powerful that it can do any human job. Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily going to happen, but you can see where that would go, which is that eventually human labor would become worthless, and the people who own the AI are going to become the only people with any money in the world. And so we really need to figure out a way to rebalance that, because that's not an economy anymore. That's just a destructive, exploitative system where some people get nothing and a few people get everything. So we really need to figure out a way to make sure that money continually flows through society. Now, some people have talked about universal basic income, and some people have talked about other ways of trying to make sure that the money is still flowing through society. But I think we need to think about that very carefully. We don't necessarily have to plan for that maximal extent of things right now, but we at least need to see that trend is possible there. So when we talk about growth, I think we need to remember that growth might be great for a few people who are in control of the AI, but it might actually be the opposite of growth. It might be a form of decay or destruction to people who are not being benefited by that further automation of society.
Okay, so let me try and give you a little more hopeful answer than my doom and gloom friend here, which those are all very important things and we need to be thinking about them. I guess the way I react to that question is, rather than to emphasize and think about the AI part of that question, I find myself going to the growth part of that question and feeling like what we really need to be redefining is what is growth in today's world. If we just keep growing and making more and more things, at some point we run out of space, right? It's not a good thing for the planet anyway. Even if we didn't have climate change, we just would eventually, it's not sustainable. And so sustainable growth, I think, has to be what we focus on now. And therefore defining what's successful and contributing AI has to be defined as things that can contribute in ways that are sustainable. Or that improve sustainability, and reward those things. And so an AI that helps me answer the question for myself, how many, I don't know, trying to think of something practical. How many airplane trips should one person take in a lifetime? And how do I keep track of them? What's just a different way of thinking about our actions and their impact, and a different way of defining growth. And so maybe it's our growth in understanding about that impact, and therefore we should try and develop some tools and some technologies that help us to manage that differently.
Great. I enjoyed both of the answers, the gloom and doom and the more, because they're both relevant. I think we do have to look at both sides. So thank you for that. I would like to open it up to questions from participants. If anyone who is on the live call wants to ask a question, you can type it in the chat, or if you'd like to unmute yourself. We're a fairly small group, and I think we can manage that. So
I saw a question just appear in the chat.
Oh, yes. Can artificial intelligence be dangerous? Is the question.
And I would say that I'm at the Partnership on AI, I'm a part of a group that's called Safety Critical AI. So yes, it can be dangerous. And we're seeing this already in terms of self-driving cars, for example. There are an increasing list of accidents that have happened where self-driving cars have crashed into other vehicles or have done other sorts of unexpected things that have been dangerous, driving into walls, driving into other trucks, driving into other vehicles. So the danger aspect is definitely there if you're putting it in something like a vehicle. Just because driving is dangerous, people get in accidents, fairly regularly. Tens of thousands of people die every year in car accidents. And one of the interesting things about self-driving cars is that companies, for example, that are producing self-driving cars, they aren't making a standard of perfection when they're creating these cars. They're not saying that their cars will never have accidents. What they're saying is that their cars will be safer than human drivers. And that's an interesting change, right? So for example, it's something like 90% of automobile accidents are caused by human error. A person just makes a mistake of some sort, whether they're being too aggressive or whether they just make a mistake, whatever it might be. A self-driving car, if it turns out to be, twice as safe as a human being, does not become perfect. It's still going to be making, something like 45% of the accidents will be because of, the self-driving car causing them. Half of the 90% that the humans were causing before. So there are still going to be accidents. There are going to be different kinds of accidents. There are going to be cases where people are, getting injured or killed when they wouldn't have gotten killed if they had been driving themselves. That's kind of the next question, right? Which is that being better than the average driver might mean that a really good driver is actually being driven by a system that's worse than they would have been if they had been driving themselves. And so we have to ask ourselves, this might be great. Self-driving cars will be terrific for people who are bad drivers, But for a person who's a really good driver, maybe the self-driving car is actually going to be a riskier way for them to get around. And so we do have to do a lot of these kind of balancing and thought experiments and thinking about these sorts of things. And of course, it's not just self-driving cars. There are lots of other ways that AI can do things that are dangerous also, whether it's with something like a lethal autonomous weapon system or other sorts of things. But always we need to remember what's the comparison with humans, because humans do make mistakes all the time. And hopefully, ideally, the artificially intelligent system will be better than humans. And hopefully it'll continue to get better and hopefully make for a safer world. And yet at the same time, we do need to recognize that we're making trade-offs there.
And I'll just say briefly, I think another danger is that it's changing the way humans think and behave. And so some of that is just, just to take an example of AI that's used in all kinds of marketing, all kinds of algorithms that push a lot of spam and junk into your email box or, your browser or whatever, which starts to train you to just disregard things and to just, to just delete, decide that something's not meaningful. And I do think we're starting, all of us, to experience, deleting something or blowing past something that was meaningful. And but it's getting washed out by other things that algorithms and other forms of AI are allowing to have, sort of just barrage us with. Or even the way we think about ourselves, and the behavior piece might be, I'm thinking about in healthcare. I think many of us have probably received phone calls that are, a robot calling us from our insurance company, where they've taken a couple pieces of information and made a decision. Oh, you need this. And now they're telling us that we should be worried about something that maybe we shouldn't really be worried about. And we're not talking to our doctor about it. We're getting a robotic phone call from our insurance company. And then there's just the, we teach and try and use nonviolent communication and restorative justice practices at the university where Brian and I work. But, we get crankier when we're sort of overwhelmed by all that stuff. And we're not as kind and compassionate with other people. Even when we finally do get to the human being, we're often very annoyed. And even though we know, intellectually, we know that the person that we're talking to isn't responsible for the barrage or the poor customer service experience that has gotten us to them, ultimately, we're still pretty annoyed by the time we get to them. And so the interaction is very different.
Yeah, there are two more questions in the chat, and then we'll finish for the night. The first one is, will China be the AI superpower?
So this is an interesting question, because I actually assign a book to my students called, it's Kai-Fu Lee's book called, what is it? Silicon Valley, AI Superpowers, Silicon Valley, China, and the New World Order, or something like that, by Kai-Fu Lee. I actually strongly recommend the second half of that book. The first half of the book is a little bit, it's a kind of a wild look at the wild west of the Chinese tech industry and how the companies are constantly sabotaging each other and doing kind of these terrible things to each other. But the second half of the book is about him talking about ethics, basically, and how he came to realize that the most important thing that he believes that AI will teach us is that we're the humans, and the AI can go do the computery type stuff, and we really need to be humans. We need to care for each other. We need to show compassion and those sorts of things. And that's something that I agree with. I think most faith traditions can actually agree with that also, which is that the highest calling for humans on earth is not just thinking about stuff. Our highest calling is to love each other and to care for each other. And that's a really important thing to keep in mind. Now, going back to the question of whether China is going to lead in this, that's something that people have been arguing about for a number of years now. China certainly has a lot of investment in AI. They have some very strong companies that are working on that. The United States does too. I think it's going to be a question of both nations going forward, and then the rest of the world is going to have to decide which of the two they want to follow. And so we're going to end up with perhaps a kind of a bipolar world where China has a huge amount of AI technology in the United States and the Western world, Europe, included in that, and many others, because United States tech companies are particularly international. It's going to be a question of who wants to participate in whose system.
Yeah, I would just say, following that briefly, the human nature seeks autonomy, and in its own, just we want to be able to make decisions for ourselves, and so AI that is created to support and sustain that desire, I think, will be sought by as many people as are aware of it, to seek it. And that, I think, works against China's power base. And so that's my hope, is that the more democratic applications will prevail.
Let's end on a positive note with our final question, which is, could you please share a couple of important examples that you're familiar with that are positive uses of AI?
Oh, I can say a couple of things for sure, which is that AI permits us to do things that used to be impossible, right? That used to be, if you had 10 million pieces of data in a system, no human was going to be able to handle that. It's just impossible. So it lets us process larger data sets. It lets us look at more information in terms of, for example, environmental information. This is something that came to my awareness just a little bit, last year, I guess, which is that there are satellites, of course, orbiting the Earth, taking pictures of the Earth all the time, but no human can look at all that satellite imagery and process, are the trees in this area growing or are they being chopped down? And ultimately, you could feed that through, some sort of machine learning model that'll quantify the total coverage of trees on the entire planet and say, yes, actually trees are growing back in this area, but they're being chopped down in this area. And it gave a number for the total number of trees in the world. And it's, that no human being could do that. It's really kind of amazing information. There are also other areas like fraud detection. Machine learning is great at detecting fraudulent transactions. It's also good at cyber defense. And that's not something that we think about all the time, but cyber warfare, cyber attacks are going on all the time. And often they're faster than a human can deal with. So if a human can't deal with it, you have to automate the response. And that's where artificial intelligence can be the automated microsecond respondent to, okay, we're being attacked, all of a sudden we can cut those off and we can protect our systems that way. So there really are, there are good reasons that artificial intelligence is being developed. We just have to make sure that we're really aiming for the beneficial uses and making the bad uses more difficult. We have serious decisions to make there.
Yeah, my mind went to data sets as well. Again, maybe just because of the week I've had healthcare, and the ability to be able to see patient data from just so many, and also patient data from populations that don't typically get served or are underserved by the healthcare system. And now it can be easier to compile the information that might be more limited, but if you can get various data sets together, then you can start to get a picture of what is there. And also, again, back to work, just there's a lot of stuff that we all do at work that's pretty boring. And if in fact, automated and machine learning can replace some of those tasks that we want to no longer do, and allow and free us up so that we can be focused on the more critical thinking skills and the places that each of us derives that meaning from, that's a positive.
Great. Thank you. And thank you both so much, not only for sharing with us, but for the work that you do. We need it. We need it in the world. And I was so excited to have you guys share some of what you do with our group and our audience. So thank you so much for being here. And thank you everyone who's watching and all of our participants on the Zoom. And we will see you soon. And if you'd like, you can check out some of our other programs on the Interfaith Center at Miami University's YouTube channel, as well as our website. You can learn more about us at oxfordinterfaithcenter.org. So thank you all and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.